Welcome to a special episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's episode, I'm joined by Georgia Lowden, who participated in the Menzies Early Career Network. This unique network offers Australian university students a fantastic opportunity to engage with the history of the Menzies era, while connecting with like-minded peers and respected figures in the field of Australian political history. As part of their involvement in our program, the 2024 participants have contributed to a really special project, writing chapters for our upcoming book, Finding Menzies, a new generation's inspiration for foreign affairs, social policy and political thought. In today's episode, we'll delve into Georgia's experience in the program, the insights she gained, and how these insights have shaped her understanding around Menzies' legacy in modern Australia. So welcome, Georgia.
Thank you for having me.
Now, your chapter is Policy Settings and Housing Booms, Lessons from the Menzies Era, which is very, very contemporarily relevant, of course, with the
Indeed.
massive housing affordability crisis affecting, well, all Australians, but particularly people of your generation. It's a bit of a Dorothy Dixer, but what attracted you to this topic, Georgia?
Um, well, as you just said, it obviously is quite a hot topic and pertinent to my generation. Um, and I guess one of the core things that I knew about Menzies before going into this was that one of his greatest achievements was the way that he was able to really transform home ownership in this country. So he increased home ownership rates from about 53% to a peak of 73% between 1949 and 1966. So I really wanted to explore how he did that and I guess investigate whether we could apply any of those policy mechanisms that he used to contribute to solving our housing crisis today.
I get you've obviously done a lot of research for this chapter, and it's a great piece of work. But were there elements of the I guess the philosophical reasons and importance of home ownership that Menzies articulated that you found appealing?
Yeah, well, what I found particularly interesting about his approach was how values driven it was. So I think if you look at the discussion around housing today, it really takes on a kind of economic argument, which is obviously quite valid because it does provide people with economic security and retirement and all that. Um, but I think we've really lost a lot of that values driven approach that Menzies took. So he talked about homes not only as homes materials, so physical places of security where you'd live and raise your family, but he also talked about homes human and homes spiritual. He really focused on the human and spiritual and the social element of housing. And he even believed that home ownership helped to determine the health of society as a whole. He believed that home ownership was about fostering a society of engaged citizens who had a stake in the future of their country and really saw it as something that should transcend all socioeconomic divisions, which is really core to why he had such a broad political appeal to the whole cross-section of Australian society.
Yeah, I wonder if that sense around the importance of home ownership to an individual, to their family, to their community, to society, to the nation, is lost in the debates today. It is quite a functional debate. It's about dollars and cents, and not so much about the kind of, I guess, more philosophical and you know, uh, there's sort of an element of patriotism and nation building about home ownership too. And then, of course, the sort of emotional and personal aspects of it that we don't
Mm,
really see in public debates.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
So, when you look at what the Menzies government did, and you gave the statistics, which are pretty incredible, from 53% to 71%, I mean, that's quite a lift.
Mm.
How did Robert Menzies and his government go about lifting the home ownership figures through that period?
Yeah, well, the post-war era obviously had, a significant increase in demand of housing, which was driven by returning soldiers, obviously a baby boom, and post-war immigration. And Menzies did implement a series of policies, using mechanisms such as federal and state cooperation and a lot of financial incentives as well, which were really aimed at increasing housing supply, but also stabilizing prices and increasing home ownership. So it did this by promoting private investment in housing easing access to home loans and also stimulating a lot of suburban growth and construction. And quite importantly, new homes were being built at a rate which outpaced population growth. So between 1947 and 1966, housing in metropolitan areas doubled from about just under 1 million to almost 2 million. And this really played a key role in helping housing prices remain quite stable at around 250 weeks of earnings on the average wage.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Mm,
Uh, i- it's interesting. His predecessor, of course, in the Chifley government, they took a very different approach to housing, prioritising public housing, social housing over privately owned housing. Did you see interesting things in sort of the debates around how different governments conceptualize what housing should be and who should own it and its public and private benefits?
yeah, well, I think it was who was it? It probably was Chifley, I think, that criticized Menzies and saying that he was trying to create a nation of little capitalists with his
Yes,
housing
is it
policy.
Deadman, the Minister for
Oh yeah,
Housing?
that was it.
Yes,
Thank you.
that's right.
And yeah, I mean, Menzies really embraced that and said, yeah, I am actually trying to create a nation of little capitalists who are proud to own a piece of Australia and feel a sense of responsibility back to the country. And I mean, that's really core to the sort of conservative liberal philosophy, right? Of social responsibility and reward for effort and all those sorts of ideas, rather than the Labor approach, which is more welfare based and giving people homes to live in rather than encouraging their aspiration to own their own.
How do you think that sort of debate, little capitalists versus, not little, not wanting little capitalists? Well, I mean, how would that play out today, do you think? Is it hard to imagine politicians talking in such terms?
Yeah, I feel like you wouldn't get Labor criticizing little capitalists these days. It would be more of a Greens approach, because I think there's more of a push towards the centre from the left-wing parties these days, or at least the Labor Party. Yeah, so I don't think you'd have quite the same rhetoric around it. And I guess largely thanks to Menzies, we have become a nation that is so home ownership is so entrenched in our culture that I don't think the public would take very kindly to that kind of criticism towards the aspiration of owning a home, which I think most young people have, even ones who wouldn't be right of centre.
Yeah, it's interesting because the Australian Greens have really pushed for renters' rights and wanting rent caps, and there's a sort of sense that maybe the Australian dream of home ownership might be over, and we
Mm,
should work on solutions that are more focused on public housing and then punishing people who invest in property through the abolition of various tax incentives to invest. How does your generation receive those sorts of arguments? Because, that when you look at the Greens, they do very well among younger voters, new voters rather than older voters. So there's obviously a clash of interest there in terms of where you are on the generational spectrum, isn't there?
yeah, I mean, frankly, I think, well, in my opinion, the most appalling consequence of our housing crisis is that it's driven inequality and eroded social mobility. And social mobility, I think, is what is at the heart of what makes our nation so great and what has made our country attractive to migrants for generations. And yeah, you referenced, I guess, that argument that Alan Kohler has, which is that education and hard work were once the main social determinants of how wealthy you were in Australia, but now it comes down to where you live and what kind of house you inherit from your parents. And I just think that is disgraceful. And I think it is hard for young people to sort of buy the housing policies that are sold to them by right of centre parties when, I mean, like my generation has grown up, we remember Howard being in government. And then, the last 12 years before Albanese won government in 2022. And like, if you're an average young person today, you're thinking, well, over the last 20 years or more, it's been coalition governments that have been in power and they've allowed this housing crisis to happen. So why would we believe the policies that they sell? And I think that's why there's naturally a lot of suspicion towards right of centre parties, unfortunately, when they try to prosecute arguments on housing, and why young people would be more open to, more radical and not necessarily rational policies put forward by fringe parties.
Yeah, there's a sense of desperation. We tried all these other
Mm,
policies, like first home buyers grants, which of course were
yeah,
introduced first in 1960s by the Menzies government, and they
yeah.
just a demand side, and they just basically it's a government handout straight to the vendor, isn't it?
Mm.
How do you see those sorts of consequences of the demand side policies that I guess have started in the mid 60s and really are still sustained by government, state and federal today?
Yeah, well, economist Saul Eslake argues that that first home buyer grant, which I think was introduced in 1964, that is what set Australian politics on a trajectory of prioritising demand side policies over supply side policies, and really damaged that equilibrium that Menzies had first set in place with ensuring that supply was keeping up with demand. And then I think, you know, those kinds of policies are quite electorally popular, and they're easy vote wins and almost like a generational pork barrel, if I could be blunt about it. It's easy to, palm them out at election time and then just say, oh yeah, here's a win for first home buyers, and not look at how those policies actually damage the housing market further. They increase competition, they inflate the market by about the same amount of money that is given in the grant, because that's how it works. And yeah, like, because it's obviously a much more complicated issue to fix the housing crisis more broadly. So politicians just tend to go for the short-term win.
When you look at the challenges of the 50s and 60s and how the Menzies government addressed those challenges, and you look at the situation today, how different is the situation today, do you think, to what they had back then?
Well, we are obviously looking at quite a different set of circumstances. I guess on the pro, you've got that home ownership rates are higher than they were in the 40s, but then the con is that the amount that the amount of debt that people are having to take on in order to buy a home is like astronomically higher. Um, and in the 50s and 60s, Australia experienced strong economic growth, low inflation, low levels of public and private debt. And that really afforded the Menzies government the opportunity to invest in ambitious, large-scale housing programs, which wouldn't be as easy to do today. We've got wage stagnation, an overstretched construction sector, high levels of household debt, market speculation, all these kinds of things, and they would just complicate such initiatives. But I think what does remain true from the Menzies era is that supply is obviously critical to increasing home ownership. And that would require obviously a recalibration of policy settings away from demand side measures and back to supply side solutions. So looking at planning reform, and then also look at reforming certain tax settings that fuel demand distortions and speculative investment, like negative gearing and the CGT exemption. So not necessarily abolishing them, but just looking at some sort of reform. And the other thing that remains true is obviously Menzies' values-based perspective on home ownership. So making sure that we're continuing to look at that underlying principle that home ownership transcends policy. Homes are not merely a structure for you to live in, but they're the cornerstone of society. And when we're thinking about what policies we want to put in place to promote home ownership, they should really be grounded in a broader vision of the society and the nation that we want to create, rather than being driven solely by economic or electoral calculations.
It's interesting too. Obviously, Australia's population back in the 40s and 50s was much, much smaller than it is today. And while we were developing cities and industrial, I guess people wanted to live around industrial areas where the jobs were, the concentration wasn't so bad. I mean, these days we are still concentrated around very few cities in Australia. But the infrastructure isn't there to enable people to live a long way away but commute in so easily, and so we sort of end up with these great sort of concentrations and congestion. The planning hasn't been great, and these challenges weren't nearly as fraught, of course, back in the 40s and 50s, just by nature of us being a entirely different numerically society. I think the other interesting thing you raise in your chapter is how that make up of a family and who lives in a house has changed, hasn't it? Do you want to talk a bit
Yeah.
about that, Georgia?
Yeah, sure. So, obviously we have an aging population and people are having less children. I think those are two of the key aspects of it. So like I think ideally if you're looking um at changing planning settings in a way that does accommodate for a changing society, you'd be looking at having some sort of like circular pattern in the way that people live over their lives. So first home buyers perhaps buy an apartment where traditionally they would have bought, house on a quarter acre block. Now they buy an apartment, they have children, hopefully then they can live in a quarter acre block, a home, whatever they'd like. And then when they are empty nesters and they're looking to retire, they can downsize back into an apartment. And what you have today is people, empty nesters, like I guess the North Shore would be a classic example where I live. There are a lot of people around me living in 4 or 5 bedroom homes and they don't have any children anymore. And yeah, sure, it's lovely, but if you're looking at a housing crisis and freeing up land or just freeing up larger properties for families, that is something that we need to take into consideration as well. So whether you look at policies like land tax reforms and abolishing stamp duty and replacing it with land tax, things like that, that sort of incentivize that movement over time.
I mean, this is the wicked problem of these intergenerational challenges to policy, isn't it? Where you have
Mm,
people at one stage of life and people at another stage of life who whose interests kind of collide, and
yeah.
that's of course what you grapple with in your chapter. Well, thank you so much for coming on Afternoon Light, Georgia, and talking about the policy settings and housing booms, lessons from the Menzies era. It's been delightful.
Thanks so much, Georgina.